Good morning, everyone. It's Kim Bailey with Alzheimer's Orange County, and we'd like to welcome you to today's webinar, Transgender Affirming Practices. We appreciate you being here. As you know, these complimentary webinars are brought to you through a three-part collaboration: O'Connor Mortuary, Care Choice Hospice and Palliative Services, and Alzheimer's Orange County. And the reason for these sponsorships and these webinars is that we came together to have this service for the community on topics that are beneficial for anyone who works with or cares for older adults. So we certainly hope that you find the webinars to be informative and useful. And today, we are so pleased to have Marnie Riley with us to present on this topic. And before I introduce her to you, I will go over what's necessary for you to obtain your continuing education credit for this webinar. So Marnie is a licensed marriage and family therapist who works with couples, individuals, and families on issues around grief and anxiety, depression, relationships, and gender identity. So as a gender specialist, much of her practice is dedicated to working with transgender, gender nonconforming, and gender variant clients, as well as their loved ones and families. So Marnie is a member of the World Professional Association for Transgender Health and an advocate who educates students and professionals about creating trans-affirming practices. So this is a very timely topic, and we feel very fortunate to have an expert with us today to educate us and answer questions for us. And so it is at this time that I'm going to go ahead and turn the reins over to Marnie Riley. And Marnie, thank you for being with us today.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to be here and so happy that the sponsors are supporting this presentation and this topic on working with trans clients and patients. I'm also really glad that you, the audience, are here and that you're a likely very diverse audience with all levels of education about transgender identity and levels of experience working with transgender patients and clients. And I'm just so glad that you're here and interested in learning more. The presentation is going to likely start out a bit Transgender 101, just to kind of get everybody on the same page, but then it'll move into a little bit more depth in terms of the topics. So my name's Marnie Riley, as Kim mentioned, and my pronouns are she, her, hers. And I am a licensed marriage and family therapist with a private practice in Irvine, California. Some of my clients are adolescents, but the majority of my clients are adults. And I do see older adults, and probably about between 70 to 80% of my clients identify in some way as transgender or gender nonconforming in some way. What we're going to talk about today is, again, like I said, we're going to start out a little bit basic. We're going to talk about the context. Who are we talking about when we talk about our transgender clients and patients, and just a little bit of basic vocabulary. Then we'll get into talking about ourselves and increasing our own awareness of who we are and what we bring as clinicians and practitioners to working with our patients and clients. We look at our own cultural assumptions and our environment, the society we're in. Then we're going to move into talking about concrete steps that you can take to better serve your gender diverse clients. So that's going to be really, again, nuts and bolts of concrete steps you can take to show your clients, your patients, that you are trans affirming and that you have some education and knowledge around working with gender diversity. So what are these terms? We're going to start with transgender, the purple bubble there. Transgender typically is used as an umbrella term, and it generally can be defined as somebody whose gender that they were assigned at birth does not line up, does not align with their internal sense of their own gender. So when I say gender assigned at birth, what that means is usually the doctor is the person who assigns your gender, maybe when you're in utero or right when you're being born, by looking at your genitals. And if you have typically male genitalia, you'll be called a boy, and if you don't, then you'll be called a girl. But that doesn't take into account your own gender identity. You're just assigned a gender at birth. Cisgender is the majority of people identify as cisgender, which means that the identity that they were assigned at birth aligns with how they identify. So transgender society and population is probably in the US about 1 to 3% of the US population would identify in some way as transgender, and gender nonconforming is the right-hand side bubble. That term is used in literature, in peer-reviewed articles, in more of the academic literature, and it is still used, like I used it in my bio, but to be honest, I'm actually hearing now that things are changing and that term is falling out of favor a bit. So that's something just to keep in mind, is that the language around gender and what they use to identify themselves changes all the time, and that's something that we need to keep on top of if we really want to be affirming in working with our clients. Non-binary is a term that probably a lot of you have heard, especially if you're in California. Last year, State Bill 179, the Gender Recognition Act, was signed into law in California, and that is going to provide people who don't identify as either male or female on the binary with a gender marker on their state documents that better indicates their own gender identity. So non-binary will be a gender marker option on state documents. So again, what's the gender binary? So we got pink on the left, blue on the right. These are boxes that we get put into. Pink, girl, boy, blue. You're one or the other. That's the only options you're given at birth, pretty much. And it's funny that pink is identified with girls now. It wasn't always that way. It used to be identified with boys. So this is the gender binary when people talk about gender binary, and the messaging of the gender binary is everywhere. So these images might look familiar. It's a girl, before the child's even born. Basically, there are parties and pink cakes and celebrations around very feminine and soft pink representations of the child. And if you walk down an aisle at Target or Walgreens, like this one, for instance, it's pretty clear who this is marketed toward, with the Barbies and the Disney and all the pink and the fluffy tutus on the right. On the other hand, we've got It's a Boy, blue, kind of adventuresome images. And if you walk down the aisle at a store, you'll see this aisle, for instance, in this picture is very geared toward boys. And the messaging is very clear that these are more aggressive and more action-oriented toys based on the gender binary. This is just a photo I took near a park near my home. I thought it was kind of funny. It's just an example of how the gender binary shows up in our lives every day, and we might not even notice it. It's just so ubiquitous. If you look here at, this was a sign in my park at one of the stations to do exercises, and you see there are 3 stages of different levels of difficulty for doing the leg kick. And stage 1, I guess, is the beginner stage. Stage 2, intermediate, and stage 3 would be the more advanced. But the way that they indicate that is what I think is a picture of maybe a little boy. I'm assuming stage 2 is a picture of a woman because there's a ponytail, and stage 3 is a man because he has short hair. So these are all just these assumptions that when we start thinking about the gender binary, we notice that, for instance, I guess if you have a ponytail, you can only do 10 leg kicks, so better keep it at that. The gender-bred person, this is a diagram that if it's interesting to you and it would be helpful, you can look it up at, it's pronounced metrosexual, and it just gives a really quick visual about the differences between gender identity, gender expression, biological sex, and sexual orientation and romantic attraction. So again, this might be very basic information, but surprisingly, a lot of people don't understand the difference between gender identity and sexual orientation. So this spells it out in the sense that identity is in your brain. You can see the gender-bred person, the brain is identity. This is how you feel internally about your own gender identity. And attraction is your heart. Who are you romantically attracted to? Who are you sexually attracted to? So there's a difference there between sexual orientation and gender identity. I think that they get confused often. So terms and labels, we've been talking about some terms and some labels, and in some ways these can be helpful. They aid in communication, and they also, if you ask somebody how they identify, then that can convey respect and openness that you're not making an assumption. On the other hand, they can be really unhelpful because, as I mentioned earlier, they're always changing. They just scratch the surface. There isn't, if you identify, let's say, as non-binary, that might tell me a little bit about you, but there's so much more to know about you that we don't want to get stuck in labels, even though labels can sometimes feel really affirming for people. But there's no consensus. This is so individualized that we really need to ask people how they identify and let them tell us rather than make assumptions. All right, so when we're looking at understanding ourselves and others, we need to look at when we're working with clients who identify as transgender, that we look at what barriers we might be bringing to be able to truly care in an affirming manner. And earlier in the presentation, I was showing all those images that we're so bombarded with that are very in the gender binary of blue and yellow, blue and pink, and we're basically marinating in the gender binary our whole lives. And now I'm asking you to consider how that might impact you when you're working with people who are more gender diverse or identify as transgender. Maybe there's some transphobia that you feel, or maybe there's a lack of awareness, maybe there's a lack of education, which is partially what we're addressing now. But you can also look at your own privilege. So privilege can be defined as unearned access to resources only readily available to some people as a result of their advantaged social group membership. So when I go into a room with a client who identifies as transgender, I need to remember that I'm bringing cisgender privilege into the room with me, and that can be something that we discuss. We also can look at intersectionality of identities. So there are lots of things that make up somebody's identity, not just gender identity. Maybe their age, their income, race, sexual orientation, if they have a physical impairment. So there's a lot of different pieces of our identity that may overlap, and that may not be in the majority. And we have to remember that the pieces that may be part of a marginalized population do impact how we see the world and how we interact with others. So when we're looking at who is our client, who is our patient, and we're talking about older transgender adults, we have to remember that this is a very diverse community and historically marginalized, even within the LGBT community itself. Older trans adults, so we're talking about people 65 plus, are one of the most invisible and underrepresented populations in research today. In preparation for this webinar and in other talks I've done, I've read a lot of peer-reviewed articles, academic papers about research working with transgender older adults. There aren't a lot. This is, as I said, very underrepresented in research, but there are some, and so that's what I'm going to bring you today as we follow along in the webinar. So as of the 2010 U.S. Census, 1.2 million to 2.8 million trans elders are in the U.S. So that's who we're looking at. Of course, with the baby boomers getting older, that number is going to get even larger. And we have to remember that a census is self-disclosure, and so it's possible that people didn't feel comfortable disclosing their trans identity, and so the numbers might actually be higher than that. So people who are now 65 plus came of age during a time of significant discrimination and stigma. There's a unique historical context with those who came of age during the civil rights movement. We're talking Stonewall, 1969, the Vietnam War. Historically, there were very few positive role models or images of trans people in the media. Generally, it was representations that were very shame-based and caricatures and just really, really negative role models or models or representation of trans people. And even though today's society is changing and there's a lot more visibility and a lot more understanding of gender diversity, those scars of shame and fear remain in people. That's really internalized, and it's very hard to soothe and to heal those scars. So when you're working with someone who is older and identifies as transgender, you're looking at someone who's lived, 65 years plus with all of this messaging from the society that's been very marginalizing. So continuing on talking about who is our client, who is our patient, and what are typically their experiences with healthcare providers. Transitioning prior to the 1990s, people were told that they had to leave their families. that was the overall best practices recommendation from clinicians to transgender people who were transitioning, saying you should leave your family. Basically, it was like the witness protection program almost, it seems. Like, you need to leave your family, you need to move across the country, you need to start fresh, and don't tell anyone about your past. And that left people with absolutely no support systems. And we know from research that support, social support, and support from family, support from friends, and from community is one of the #1 indicators of health, mental health, physical health, and successful aging, successful transitioning. So this was really detrimental to be told at this time prior to the 1990s to not transition within the context of your own life. There was also a gatekeeper model. So the gatekeeper model meant that the clinician knew best, the doctor, the mental health provider knew best about your gender, and so you needed to either justify or somehow prove your gender to be able to get the care that you needed. And we don't ask non-trans or cisgender people to justify their gender identity. So this model is still, there's still some fear from many people in the community that if they go to seek healthcare, that they're going to be asked to somehow either prove or justify their gender to be able to get either hormones or possibly gender confirming surgeries. And if not that, then at minimum to have to educate their healthcare providers about trans care. There's also a fear of being traumatized or re-traumatized or victimized actually by people who should be helping professionals. There was the National Transgender Discrimination Survey was done in 2015 with 28,000 respondents, and there was a lot of response. About 1/3 of those who responded said that in the year prior to the survey, they had a negative experience with a healthcare provider. So that could mean verbal harassment. It could mean being refused treatment based on their gender identity. And 23%, so almost a quarter of respondents, did not seek healthcare because of a fear of mistreatment. I mean, if you can imagine a quarter of your patients not coming to you because they were afraid of either mistreatment or being denied care, that's absolutely something that we have to change. So let's move on to looking at some of the challenges that people face when they're transitioning later in life. And some of the concerns are what most aging adults might face, such as concerns about loneliness or health or income. But there's another layer, which might be a fear of rejection by family or marginalization by society. If you imagine somebody, let's say, in their senior years who hasn't yet transitioned and is longing to live the rest of their life as their identified gender, as their affirmed gender, how they feel internally, but they haven't yet transitioned. Maybe they have fears about caregiving. Maybe they're afraid that their adult child who might be the caregiver will reject them or marginalize them. This is something that's real that people consider when they consider transitioning later in life. There's a lot of grief as well. I hear this from clients all the time, and actually I hear it from them no matter what age they are, at time lost, and this sense that time has gone by in quote unquote the wrong gender, and this grief that comes up about time spent, maybe a young adulthood spent, and an adulthood spent not as their authentic selves. And this can never be recaptured. They will never go through a young adulthood or all the experiences that form us as the gender with which they identify. There's a huge sense of time lost and grief at that. Sometimes another challenge that people have with transitioning later in life is feeling trapped in their current life. So perhaps they're married and they have kids and they have an established job, and they're afraid that if they come out and they transition and they disclose their gender identity to the people in their lives, that they're going to lose everything that they've built, in the sense of it's too late. Another barrier is that elder care options are often not trans affirming. So I know that many of you listening today are working in assisted livings, in care facilities, and perhaps in hospice, and working with elders in facilities such as assisted livings, let's say. And I wonder how a person who identified as transgender might know that that was a safe place to be, or what kind of policies or practices are in place to really affirm their gender when they're aging in a facility. Some people who are faced with elder care decisions, such as assisted living, might even go back in the closet, so to speak, or detransition. Some people honestly even consider suicide rather than submitting to an elder care that's not trans supportive. Now we're going to move to some of the joys of transitioning later in life. Some people feel it's easier to come out later and live authentically. They may feel like they don't want to waste any more time, that they've already lived so long in their lives as a gender that they were assigned at birth that does not resonate and does not align with their own gender identity, and they feel some freedom. Maybe they're retired or divorced. They don't have a spouse to consider in transition, or maybe they do and feel that this is a journey they're going to take with that spouse. And there can be a real focus on personal growth and development. You know, sometimes when we think about aging and successful aging, quote unquote, we think about kind of looking back on life and maybe sorry, I'm not thinking of the word, but looking back and kind of gathering all of our experiences and looking toward how do we want to live the last years of our lives. Well, it might not necessarily be that we're thinking about personal growth and development, but if we're transitioning later in life, it can be this really rich and robust time of deciding that we're going to reject expectations that other people have of us, that society has of us, and maybe reject that internalized shame. Really think about resilience and our own identity. This might also be marked by bursts rather than this linear, stable timeline. So concerns specific to dementia. I know a lot of you work with people who are perhaps experiencing some symptoms of dementia. And again, when I talk about this, this is not a topic that is very researched in terms of older adults who identify as transgender and also maybe having some symptoms of dementia. So these are just, this area does need more research, but for those of you that do have experience working with people with a form of dementia, there can definitely be a lot of learning and knowledge that you can bring with a sensitivity to working with transgender clients and patients. So I mentioned earlier that the challenges of elder care facilities maybe not being trans affirming, we can look at ways, and we will later in this presentation, at making care facilities more transgender affirming. When we think about people who have a form of dementia, there's a lot of dependency on others, and perhaps they can't advocate for themselves. So some things to think about are how will a patient be gendered if they haven't had gender confirming surgeries? Perhaps the staff might make assumptions about their gender based on their genitalia or their bodies. And as best as we can, we really need to affirm the gender of the person. If we cannot ask them, and we cannot ask, then we can ask their families. Another thing to consider is perhaps at later stages, the patient may forget having quote unquote come out or disclosed, or having had gender confirming surgeries. So we have to really follow where the patient is, where the client is, and be respectful of that patient's wishes, and also respectful of their wish regarding disclosure. Perhaps they've transitioned years ago and don't identify necessarily openly as transgender, and we need to respect that as well. So the takeaway here is to really follow what it is the patient's asking for, and if they can't speak for themselves, then to do the best that we can based on the knowledge we have from the people around them in their lives who love them. Trans affirming practices. Forge Forward did a 2011 survey of over 1,000 trans people, and 59% of the people who responded reporting that having trans-friendly forms like intake forms or new client forms was, quote, extremely or very important factor in whether or not to seek services at an anti-violence agency, in this example. And that factor was second only to the reputation of the agency. So what this means is, and I've heard this from clients as well, is when looking for healthcare providers, when looking for mental health providers or any kind of healthcare services, there's a sense of looking for details that let the transgender client or patient know that they are walking into a safe space and to a trans affirming space. And one way of doing that, a very important way, is the forms. This is an example of my new client information sheet. This is just like half of the first page of my intake forms. And on my forms, what I write is, you'll see down about a third of the way, full chosen preferred name. I don't take insurance, so I don't see a need for a line that says legal name. It could be that somebody has not changed their legal name and gender marker on official documents, but that using the legal name can feel very triggering and very non-affirming to people. In fact, some people call it their dead name. So that's why I don't even ask for it, but I understand that many of you likely will have to ask for the legal name for insurance purposes, etc. But you can also ask for what their chosen name is. And I have there as well pronouns. So someone may come to me and they identify as female, but they are still presenting and living as male, as their assigned, I'm just using an example, as their assigned gender. And they might put in their legal name and their pronouns as he, him. And then maybe in the course of our work that will change. And I ask about that, and I welcome that, and I invite that, and I will change it on the forms once that person, if that person so chooses. So when we're talking about working with our transgender clients and patients, we also have to think about what are their first impressions. So is our website indicating that we work with transgender clients? I know for some of you, you may not have the luxury of changing a website if it's a facility, for instance. Me, for my private practice, I have a website dedicated to my work with gender. And this lets clients know that this is a specialty of mine, that this is a safe place where, of course, I'm always learning from my clients, but the idea is that they are not going to be having to teach me, that I'm already going to have a base knowledge when they come in. So your website, even if it is a large facility, perhaps that's something to consider. Are there some sort of messagings? Is there a message on your website that lets clients know that you are transgender affirming? Are you listed on transgender resource websites? That's another place that people search for trans affirming facilities and care. Phone contact. So if somebody calls your office or your facility, who's answering the phone? Is that person going to make assumptions about the caller's pronouns, or are they going to ask? Making an appointment, same thing. Is it going to be that the legal name is asked for, or a chosen name, a preferred name, and pronouns? What does the waiting room look like? Does the waiting room have a lot of photographs of the binary, let's say cisgender men and women, or like my waiting room, for instance, has paintings, but they're non-representational. So they're colorful and they have shapes and designs, but they're not of people. Not that you can't have people in your photographs, but just be very mindful about what representations you're showing in your waiting room. And also greetings is another thing. When I open the door to meet a new client, I might ask, I might say something like, "Hi, I'm Marnie. Are you here to see Marnie?" Rather than use a name, because somebody may have used their legal name that is kind of triggering for them in the initial contact with me, but would really prefer a different name. And so I want to start off the bat waiting till I am in a private space with them and can ask them how they prefer to be addressed. Another issue, and I'm sure you're all aware, is restrooms are a big deal. Unfortunately, in my building, for instance, we don't have single stall, and so there are quote unquote men's restrooms and women's restrooms, and I talk with my clients about that, because having having the binary restrooms is actually a really big deal for people. I know of some clients who actually get urinary tract infections because they hold their urine for so long during the day because they don't want the trauma of going into a restroom and being harassed. And people, I've heard time and time again, spend a lot of energy and thought about and anxiety around, where am I going to go to the bathroom when I'm out in public? So this is a slide of generally what we see, the binary restrooms, the women and men. But here are some examples of what might be some options that might really go a long way toward showing your transgender clients and patients and non-binary clients and patients that they are welcome and that this is a safe space. So I particularly like the one in green that says this bathroom has been liberated from the gender binary, and the all gender restroom. Anyone can use this restroom regardless of gender identity or expression. So if your facility has the ability to make single stall gender inclusive, that goes a huge way toward alleviating many of your patients and clients' anxiety. And during the appointment, if a client or patient has an appointment, then again, ask, what is the preference for name and pronoun? I don't know if you'll remember, but at the beginning of this webinar, I introduced myself and I said, my name is Marnie Riley and my pronouns are she, her, hers. That's something that you could do. You could let people know what your pronouns are, even if you think that it's quote unquote obvious, or you identify as cisgender. This is a way of flattening that hierarchy and letting people know that you're on the same page with them and that you're affirming. And you can be open but not intrusive. For instance, if the work that you're doing with somebody has nothing to do with their whether or not they may have had gender confirming surgeries, then don't ask. There's no reason for you to know that information if it's not crucial for your specific role. And also preferred presentation. So if a client comes to me and they have not yet socially transitioned, which means that they are not presenting as the gender with which they identify, I ask them if they, or I let them know that this is a safe space, that my office is a safe space, and they can present, and they can wear, and they can look like whatever they would feel most comfortable in my office. And I provide that as an option for them, just to know that they can do that. So we talked a little bit about pronouns. The top two are the binary that are probably most common, she, her, hers, and he, him, his. And at the very bottom, you'll see they, them, theirs. They, them, theirs often are preferred by people who identify as non-binary, but that isn't always the case. Again, it's important to ask people what their pronouns are. And even though here some people get caught up with using what has typically been known as a plural pronoun for an individual, it really isn't that hard. And it would go a long way toward affirming someone's identity if you use the pronouns that they prefer and that they identify with, even if grammatically it's awkward for you. It doesn't mean that it's awkward for them. The other ones you'll see here are some other options, but I don't see them as much, but I just put them up here just to familiarize you with some other options that people may use as pronouns. So just looking back at what we learned today, we talked about the context, who are our patients and clients that identify as transgender, with some basic vocabulary. Also looking at increasing our own awareness of what are some barriers to our own trans-affirming care for people, and looking at our own cultural assumptions, looking at ways that the gender binary is so pervasive in our society, and some concrete steps that you can take to welcome gender variant clients to your practice. Here is a page of some resources if you want to learn more. There's sageusa.org. These are specific to, that is a specific organization that works with the senior population. National Center for Transgender Equality, the Transgender Law Center, they're based in San Francisco, and Forge Transgender Aging Network. I mentioned one of their studies earlier in the presentation. So that's just a few options if you are interested in learning more. And you're welcome to contact me for any resources and other information. My website, phone, and email are here. Also on my website, I do have a resource page with books, with links to organizations and more resources that can help support you in working with your clients. So thank you so much, and again, thank you to the sponsors for having me be here and hopefully share a little bit about this work.
Marnie, thanks, and stay on board because we've got some questions for you. And just a reminder to all of our listeners that we haven't reached the 60-minute mark yet. And so all of you will, let's see, what time is it? Yeah. Keep an eye on your watch and stay with us through the question and answer period so that you can get your CE if that's appropriate. So I have some questions for Marnie, starting with, I think this one did get answered. So for non-binary, the pronouns are they, them, and theirs?
Well, again, it's important to ask a specific person, a specific individual, what their pronouns are. And just anecdotally, I will say that they, them, theirs has tended to be the most common that I've heard, typically that people who identify as non-binary may utilize. But that doesn't mean that that's true for everybody. There are some people who, when you ask what are your pronouns, they may say, I don't care. You use whatever you want. She, her, hers, he, him, his, they, them, theirs. Some people say, I don't have pronouns, use my name. So it's so individualized. But if we're going to talk about just anecdotally what I have, my experience has been in hearing my clients and other readings, that mostly people are using they, them, theirs if they identify as non-binary. But again, that is totally an individual choice.
Okay, thank you, Marnie. Our next question, this is a great question. Would it be appropriate, well, they're all great actually, but this one is, would it be appropriate to add a line to your business card, something like gender affirming? Or is there another phrase that would be even more appropriate, just to sort of broadcast that you are in fact gender affirming?
Yeah, I think that's great. Like on my website, I have LGBTQIA affirming, I believe. On my email, if I were to send you an email, and in my signature line, you'll see that I have my pronouns. So it'll say, I think it says pronouns she, her, hers. It might just say she, her, hers. Some people on their business card have their pronouns, which is, again, a detail and a signal of affirmation. So yeah, I think that's a great idea.
Thank you, Marnie. Our next question is, I haven't heard of the other pronouns. What do they convey as far as a person's identity? So maybe, Marnie, you'd kindly go back to that slide with the pronouns again and maybe walk us through that a little bit more.
Sure. Well, these are just some pronouns that have been used, but not the ones that are between the he and the they, the Z, etc. I don't hear them as often. Basically, the idea is I don't identify as what perhaps the assumption may be. So I may not identify as she, her, hers. So I might use something else that identifies me as not within the binary. So these are just some others that are offered in this example, but again, I don't see those regularly used. It's mostly the she, he, and they. But again, I do know people who feel like no pronoun really feels exactly right for them, and struggle with finding a pronoun that fits better.
Thank you, Marnie. And then another clarifying question. What does the I and A mean in LGBTQIA?
Oh, sure. So I generally stands for intersex. The antiquated word for intersex you may have heard is hermaphrodite. That is not used any longer. It's basically when somebody's genitals are not easily within the male or female. It could be some ambiguity in the genitalia. So that is, but it's not just genitalia. It could also be at a chromosomal level. So that's what intersex, or the I stands for, is intersex. And A can be asexual, agender, it could be ally. So the A can stand for a lot of things.
Okay, thank you, Marnie. And our next question is, in RCFE settings, residential care facilities or board and cares, some are all female and some are all male. And staff may be all female, all male, or mixed. So clients often prefer to be with the same gender roommates and staff. So how do we go about legally hiring staff if the home prefers a specific gender?
Well, it would be based on gender identity. So
I'm trying to unpack this question a little bit here. Do you understand exactly what they meant,
well,
Marnie?
I guess what I'm you know, what this question brings up for me is thinking about, like, for instance, a traditionally all girls college or all women's college. I wonder if that could be a parallel. And a lot of colleges are making policies now based on being transgender affirming. So let's say someone enters a typically all female college and identifies as male and transitions to male while at college, that's fine. So I'm thinking about that in terms of a facility. I guess it would be, you know, I don't know legally for a small board and care, but I would assume that you would go based on somebody's gender identity, not on what identity they were assigned at birth.
Okay. The same listener is sort of fleshing this out a little bit and asking a couple more questions. Is it legal to advertise a home as LGBT friendly or lesbian, gay, or transgender? Can they say they're women only? Can they say they're male only? So again, I know that you can't speak to the legality of that, but
yeah, you know, I can't speak to the legality, but I could say that the Transgender Law Center that I have in the here, let me. Yep. There, the Transgender Law Center might have better direction in terms of the legality, but I don't see a problem with saying that you're LGBT affirming.
I think, Marnie, that there's just sort of some broader questions. I mean, we're all getting knowledgeable about this, or trying to, and you know, prepare and do the right thing. And I think that for the world of assisted living and RCFEs, I think that we're all going to have questions about, you know, what do we do if this, that, or the other occurs? You know, as far as one of the questions that this listener was asking, it's like, if you have a transgender person and they identify as female and they've had the gender affirming surgery, what does that mean in terms of, like, the roommate situation? You know, what if that roommate objects to that? Or how do we sort of socialize older adults living in these environments to accept people who are different? I mean, I think it's just sort of a big, broad issue that requires, just more and more education and more dialogue, because there's a lot of what if scenarios that are kind of floating around my head, and I think with the other listeners as well. So it's just so great to have you here to give us this baseline information and get us thinking along these directions. It's just, we appreciate you so much. And I do want to say that we are past the 60-minute mark, and I am looking, I'm not seeing that we have any other questions. So I think we're going to end. I have just a couple little things that I want to remind you of. One is that we just had a fantastic speaker, so I want to remember to thank her for sharing her time and her expertise with us. I also want to remind everyone of our next free webinar coming up on Tuesday, October 9th. And our topic will be oral hygiene to decrease risk of infection in older adults. So that will be another great topic. And then let's see, I want to thank our sponsors, O'Connor Mortuary, Alzheimer's Orange County, and Care Choices Hospice and Palliative Care for the ongoing commitment that they've made to presenting these fascinating seminars, webinars on a monthly basis, and making sure we're all informed. And so with that, a reminder that as we close the webinar, you will be receiving, it should pop up on your screen, your evaluation. If you don't see that, then watch for it in your email. Be sure to check your spam folder if you don't see it. And in closing, I want to thank you all for your participation today. And don't forget that if you want to know more about other webinars and other types of educational opportunities, you can go to our website, www.alzoc.org. And with that, I'll say thank you once again and have a great day.